Before you put big power to any V8, you gotta upgrade the driveline. Today, we're all about transmissions, coolers, rear ends, and the modifications needed to make it all work. Truck Tech begins now.
We've got our late model Silverado in the shop today for some final upgrades to the drivetrain before it gets its final boost in performance. And when we're done, this late model Silverado will be a high performance street sleeper that can clean up at the track and still get you to work Monday through Friday.
There are a few areas we're going to address, like the transmission, the rear axle, and the drive shaft. We want to take care of any factory weaknesses that may remain. So when all that horsepower goes up, we won't have any worries.
This Silverado came from the factory with a 6L80 6-speed automatic transmission. And while they do have their strong points, they aren't the most robust transmission in the whole world, especially once you start tossing a power adder into the mix like we're about to do. Now don't get me wrong, there are some people out there who have decent power going through a 6L80, but there's also people out there who damage them on a stock engine. And this is the perfect example. When this truck had only 150,000 miles on it, the rear planetary gear set stripped off, sent material through the pump, and took out the entire transmission. So, needless to say, we don't have a ton of faith in the stock automatic. So what's the solution? Well, we're going to swap this trans out with another one and show you guys at home what it takes to make that happen.
We started by looking for a transmission that would handle the power we're about to put down, and the natural choice for us was the tried and true 4L80. You can think of it as a turbo 400 with overdrive. It's a 4-speed automatic that came in 3/4 and 1-ton pickups since the early 90s. But any old junkyard 4L80 just isn't going to cut it.
We know that monster transmission built some pretty stout automatics, so we ordered an extreme Super Duty version of the 4L80E. It's rated at 1,100 horsepower and 1,000 pound-feet of torque, so we know it's going to withstand whatever we can throw at it, and then some. It's upgraded with goodies like a Kevlar band, front and rear, a heavy-duty sprag, and recalibrated valve body. We chose to upgrade our transmission with a deep sump aluminum pan for greater fluid capacity and cooling, a 2,500 RPM stall converter with a billet front plate, and a case of transmission fluid.
It's one thing to bolt the transmission into the truck, but you late model guys may be wondering how we're going to control this electronic trans. Well, a quick search of the web led us to PCM of North Carolina and their 6L80 to 4L80 swap harness. It takes all the guesswork out of this conversion, and it utilizes a factory trans controller and integrates perfectly with the body control module. This way we're able to keep stuff like cruise control and our factory trans temp gauge. So with just a little bit of research, we're able to convert this truck to a 4L80 and have no fear of breaking anything in the trans. We get started by tearing this thing down.
Use a jack to support the rear of the trans so the crossmember can be removed. We're doing this first so we can get to the exhaust. I always drain the trans fluid before I remove it to prevent spilling later on. So the pan comes off and the trans fluid is drained. Reinstall the pan to keep dirt out while it's in storage. On the side of the trans, disconnect the shift cable and arm. Next up, the starter comes out along with a plastic dust cover to expose the torque converter bolts. Use a breaker bar on front of the crank to turn the engine by hand to expose and remove each of the 3 bolts. The drive shaft is in the way, so that is next to go. Remove all the bell housing bolts, and the trans is ready to come out. The dowel pins were rusted on this one, so a little persuasion was necessary. Before you go ahead and install that new torque converter into your transmission, there's a couple things you definitely need to take care of so you don't cause damage later on down the road. And the first and most important of those is fluid level. You absolutely never ever want to install a torque converter that's bone dry. If you forget the fluid, what'll happen is when you first start it up, it takes a very long time for the front pump to fill it with fluid, which means it's turning with no lubrication. And that could potentially damage the torque converter. And I don't know about you guys, but I really don't want to pull out a trans a second time just because I forgot a little bit of fluid. The next thing I like to do is take a little bit of ATF and just wipe it on the sealing surface of the torque converter. That way when we slide the converter into the transmission, it won't tear it. Now, a seal is something that's small and very inexpensive, but if it's damaged, that means pulling the trans out just to fix it. So we're going to definitely not do that. Carefully install the new torque converter, making sure it's fully seated. I just want to make sure you hear 3 clumps when you install one of these. There's 1. There's, felt like 2. I think that may be in. Yep, that's definitely fully seated.
Cool. One thing to keep in mind when swapping out a 4L80 behind an LS is torque converter pilot spacing. These swaps have become so popular that companies like Monster have started selling torque converters with an extended pilot. This way, we don't have to run a spacer, which is designed for a stock torque converter. Now, if we were to run this spacer, there's a good chance that we could damage the pump inside the transmission, and if the pilot were too short, could damage a bearing. Let's see if we can get these flywheels swapped out.
Remove the old wimpy flex plate and clean the mating surface of the crank to make sure everything sits flat. Torque to 75 foot-pounds.
Next, cross-cutting the crossmember.
We're back on the install of our Monster 4L80E. With a new trans rolled underneath the truck, raise it up into place and line everything up. Once it's seated, start some bell housing bolts and then torque them down. This transmission swap has been 100% bolt in so far. It couldn't be going any smoother. But we're about to hit our first roadblock. And let me show you what I mean when we go to install this transmission crossmember. Now these mounts, they're welded to the frame, but unfortunately the transmission mount on the 4L80 is a few inches farther towards the rear than it was on the 6L80. So this just isn't going to bolt up. Now there's 2 different ways we could go about fixing this problem. The first would be to cut these mounts off the frame, slide them farther toward the rear, and re-weld them. Now that's very time consuming and not necessarily worth all the effort. So I'm going to show you an easier way to make this repair that's just as strong. It's going to start by making a couple different marks and cutting the crossmember into 3 separate pieces. With the cut lines marked with a square, cut the crossmember. We're using a bandsaw, but there are many tools you could use to do this job. With the pieces all lined up, you can start to see how we're going to make this transition. We need about an additional 5 inches. So I'm going to take the pieces that we cut off, slide them ahead, and fill the gap with this 3/16 plate steel that I cut beforehand. Now I'll probably go back in and add a gusset later on, but this is going to be more than strong enough for what we need to accomplish. Now you can actually use this technique for any type of transmission swap that you need where you can't physically slide the crossmember back and forth on the frame. I guess it's true what they say about measure twice and cut once. Once you know it'll fit right, burn it in for good and apply a coat of paint to keep it all from rusting.
She's home.
Heat is one of the main enemies in any automatic transmission, and 2 things that make more heat are a higher stall speed torque converter and more power, both of which this truck will have. Now we could take the chance and hook up our nice new transmission to the factory cooler, but we would just be asking for trouble. Trust me, I've seen performance transmissions hooked up that way and they didn't last very long. So we'll need an upgrade to get rid of that excess heat. For that, we'll be using Earl's plumbing. We'll start with -6 AN fittings to get the fluid from the transmission to the factory transmission cooler in the cold side of the radiator. Once the fluids pass through there and cool down a little bit, it'll make its way through this 34-row, 10.5-inch tall Earl's cooler that's 2 inches thick. Now we also picked up the optional brackets for mounting. So once we've got rid of that extra heat, then the fluid will make its way back to the transmission. We're using Earl's Pro Light 350 hose to make all the connections.
With the truck lowered down, start by removing the header panel, then pop off the grille. Remove the hood latch and the center support piece. Pop the clips on the lines and remove the trans cooler. Side by side, you can really see the difference between the old cooler and this new, much larger one. We start the installation by mocking up the cooler.
Right there, that looks good.
And once we're happy with the placement, use some vice grips to hold it while the holes get drilled for the top brackets. For the bottom, we bent some 90-degree brackets and they'll attach to the bottom of the core support. Before we install the fitting onto the end of our Earl's hose, we're actually going to slide it inside some of this DEI fire sleeve. It'll protect it from the direct heat of the exhaust and any chafing. It's made of a high temperature silicone exterior and has braided glass interior. And the best part is, it slides perfectly inside our Dash 6 hose. Nice and cozy. With a fresh end on the hose, install the first fitting. Then line the hose up underneath the truck and measure for length. Install the second fitting, tighten it at the transmission, and then at the cooler.
Ahead, a little gearing chalk talk.
Having the right gear ratio is important because it affects both acceleration and fuel economy.
If you have the wrong ratio for your specific setup, your truck will be unbearable to drive. So today, we're talking about gears. And one of the advantages of the 6L80 that came in Project White Noise is the wide gear spread, which makes for great acceleration and great low RPM cruising when you're going down the highway. First gear comes in at 402 to 1 and sixth gear at 6.7. And when we multiply by the 342 axle ratio to get the overall drive ratio, first gear comes in at 1375 to 1 and sixth gear at 229. One of the disadvantages of the stronger 4L80 is its narrow gear spread. First gear comes in at 248, which is actually closer to second gear in the 6-speed. And fourth gear comes in at 075. So we need to re-gear the truck and find a ratio that'll help us have a good compromise between acceleration and cruising RPM. So we chose 373s. Now what does the 373 mean? Well, the pinion gear turns 3 3/4 turns for every single turn of the ring gear. So when we do the math and multiply the two together, first gear comes in at 925 to 1 and fourth gear comes in at 280. And as you can see, that's not quite as wide of a spread as we had with the 6-speed. But don't forget, Project White Noise is a street strip vehicle that's going to spend most of its time, honestly, on the street. And we still want to have a great cruising RPM. If we were going to live mostly at the strip, we probably could have gone with a 411 or even a 456. But that's just not a gear ratio we're willing to live with every day of the week. Anyone familiar with late model GM trucks has probably heard of the optional G80 locking differential, also known as the Gov-Lock. Now, it's unfortunately earned the nickname Gov-Bomb because of the tendency of these small pieces to break off, get caught between the gears, and destroy the entire differential. But it's an interesting design, and here's how it works. As you lose traction and one wheel spins faster than the other, these little counterweights flip out and engage a wave plate that locks a Posi-style clutch pack at either end of the spider gear, sending equal power to both wheels. But what most people don't realize, when the vehicle goes faster than 45 miles an hour, this other counterweight flips out, preventing locking, which basically leaves you with an open differential. And for us, that just isn't going to cut it. So to re-gear and get rid of that G80, we went to Yukon Gear Axle and picked up a whole bunch of parts, starting with this 373 to 1 ring and pinion. It's a great compromise between acceleration and cruising RPM. We also got a forged 1350 pinion yoke, as well as this Dura grip style posi, and it uses springs instead of centrifugal force to apply the clutches all the time, not just when you're going under 45 miles an hour. We also picked up a reinforced differential cover that have these studs that apply pressure on the bearing caps to keep everything in line. Lastly, we got a master install kit that comes with all the bearings and seals we need to complete the installation, as well as the shims to make sure everything is adjusted properly.
The teardown starts by popping the cover and letting the fluid drain. The carrier center pin holds the axles from pushing in, so it comes out, followed by the C-clips. Pull the main caps and remove the G80 with the ring gear attached. Remove the pinion nut, and with a little persuasion, the old gears are gone. Use a long drift punch to drive the old bearing races out of the housing. Out front, the bearing race and seal all come out in one fell swoop.
With the axle housing already cleaned up, reassembly starts by driving the new races into the housing. We already took the time to check a preliminary pattern, so we'll install the correct pinion shim, Then press on the large pinion bearing. With the correct pinion depth shim installed, our next thing to set is the pinion bearing preload, and that's basically the amount of force it takes to turn this pinion shaft in the housing. And that's controlled by the distance between the two bearings. So you install a crush collar, and as you tighten the pinion nut down, the two bearings squish closer together and become harder to turn. We're shooting for a figure somewhere between 14 and 19 inch-pounds of rotational force.
You can buy a pinion holding tool, but we made ours from DOM tubing and some scrap 3/16 inch plate. Tighten the nut until all bearing play is gone. Then pay attention because the preload will go up quickly and it's easy to overshoot. If you go too far, you'll need to start over with a new crush collar. Check your manual for preload specs on your setup.
Now it's time to install the new carrier and measure backlash. Our set calls for 3 to 6 thousandths. Now cross your fingers and check the pattern. This yellow paint shows you where the gears are touching, and ideally it will be centered both front to back and top to bottom. Slide the axles in, install the C-clips, then the center pin, and the cover goes on. That's one re-geared posi rear end in the bag.
Next, our Silverado gets the shaft, ×2.
Another area we had to address with our driveline upgrades is the drive shaft itself. The factory shaft in our 2010 Silverado is made from thin wall aluminum, and when combined with 86 inches in length, it can become unstable at high speed and power levels. Just think of a jump rope and, well, you get the idea, not very good. So Precision Shaft Technologies made us a custom length 2-piece drive shaft with an aluminum rear section, and it will withstand the power we're going to make. Because it's a 2-piece shaft, the center will be supported with a crossmember made of 2x2 inch square tubing. The shafts feature beefy 1350 universal joints and a forged Strange Engineering 32 spline yoke for the 4L80E.
Whether you work or play in the great outdoors, protecting your truck's interior from the elements can be challenging. These are Seat Saver seat covers by Covercraft. They're custom patterned for a perfect fit and install in minutes over your factory seats, protecting them from sun, dirt, dogs, and the kids. It's a breathable material that repels water, and when they do get dirty, you can just slip them off and throw them in the wash. Check out all the available materials, colors, and patterns at covercraft.com.
Keeping with our sleeper theme for Project White Noise, the 17-inch OE wheels, well, they fit the bill, but those stock skinny tires just aren't going to cut it. So we went to rockauto.com and ordered a set of Keystone Silverado SS replica wheels. They're a 20 by 8.5 5-spoke design with the proper offset for late model Silverados. They're also painted silver for good looks and pretty easy upkeep. And to complete our wheel package, we picked up a set of GM tire pressure sensors so we don't have to worry about that TPMS light.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel to stand out in the tool business. But every year, Matco Tools comes pretty close with innovations that make shop life easier. This is Matco's 8-piece Top Torque 2 orange screwdriver set. Different size handles match the length of the driver, which just feels right. The textured material provides excellent grip, and the handy tray keeps them organized in your tool drawer. You can get your set from your favorite Matco Tools distributor or by visiting matcotools.com.
Well, we've got a lot accomplished on our 2010 Silverado. Our monster transmission's installed, our Earl's transcooler up front, and we rebuilt the rear axle. So at least now we'll be spinning both tires, but that's only prepared us for what's to come.
That's right. Every modification we've done to this Silverado so far has been a preparation for this. We want a good, strong foundation so we don't have to worry about breaking anything. Because next time you see this truck, we'll be bolting on the single 76mm turbo. We'll also get into the fuel system and ignition system just to make sure everything will stand up. But we'll get this thing on the dyno and we'll make some big power. That's a promise.
Cool, man. Don't blow it up.
Oh, man, this thing's pretty cool. Got 76mm compressor housing, single 3-inch downpipe, 4-inch on the filter. It's going to be sweet.